The abandoned houses stood like rotting teeth in Houston's Fifth Ward. Empty windows, sagging porches, silent witnesses to the neighborhood's struggles. But in 2007, one of these forgotten buildings held more than just memories. It held a secret that would haunt this community for years to come. They found Hattie McFarland there. Her life ended by someone who thought these empty houses could keep their sins hidden forever. 3 years later, just streets away, another abandoned home would claim another life. Lavinia Glover, a mother of 3, murdered in the same brutal fashion. 2 women, 2 crime scenes, same neighborhood, same method. The Fifth Ward, locals call it the Nickel, had seen its share of hardship. But these murders were different. These weren't random acts of violence or crimes of passion. These were calculated and deliberate. Someone was using the neighborhood's forgotten spaces as their killing grounds. For more than a decade, these cases sat cold. Evidence gathered dust in storage rooms. Families waited for answers that seemed like they'd never come. But science has a way of catching up to secrets, and in 2020, a DNA match would finally put a name to the monster who'd haunted these streets. But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask for a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss out on any new videos. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case. This is the story of 2 women whose lives were cut short in the shadows of abandoned buildings. It's about a community that never stopped asking questions, about investigators who refused to let go, and about how justice, even when delayed by decades, still finds its way home. The Fifth Ward isn't just a neighborhood on Houston's map. To the people who live there, it's the Nickel, a place where music spills from church windows, where generations of families have carved out their lives between hardship and hope. It's where both Hattie McFarland and Lavinia Glover called home, though their paths would cross only in tragedy. Hattie's story began in 1964. The Fifth Ward raised her, shaped her, taught her its rhythms and rules. Those who knew her remember a woman who could light up a room, whose laughter came easy even when life didn't. She was a constant presence on the streets she'd known since childhood, building connections with everyone from corner store owners to church ladies. Hattie had that rare gift, the ability to make friends anywhere, to find common ground with anyone. But the Nickel isn't an easy teacher. Like many in her community, Hattie faced the harsh realities of limited opportunities. She navigated the narrow spaces between survival and safety, making the kinds of choices people make when their options run thin. Yet through it all, she maintained a spirit that friends still talk about today. Resilient, vibrant, unbreakable. 18 years after Hattie was born, the Nickel welcomed another daughter, Lavinia Yvette Glover. Born in 1982, she grew up in a Fifth Ward that hadn't changed much. Still proud, still struggling, still teaching its children how to be strong. Lavinia learned those lessons well. Those who knew her speak of kindness first, how she'd help neighbors with groceries, how she'd watch other people's kids when they needed a break. But it was her own 3 children who gave Lavinia's life its purpose. Every morning found her walking the streets near Liberty Road and Gregg Street, working to build a life for her kids despite the odds stacked against her. Motherhood in the Nickel isn't for the faint of heart. Lavinia juggled the daily challenges of raising 3 children in a neighborhood where opportunity often felt as abandoned as the empty houses that dotted the streets. But she never wavered in her dedication. Her children were her North Star, guiding every decision, every sacrifice, every step forward. These women, separated by 18 years but united by their neighborhood, carried the Nickel's contradictions within them. Both knew its warmth and its wounds. Both understood what it meant to be strong in a place that demanded strength. Both were more than the tragic ends that awaited them. In Hattie's laugh and Lavinia's loving heart, you could find the Nichols' true spirit, not in the abandoned houses where their stories would end, but in the lives they built despite everything. They were daughters of Fifth Ward, women who faced each day with the quiet courage their neighborhood had taught them. Neither of them knew they would become part of a darker story. Neither suspected that the streets they'd walked all their lives would lead them into shadow. But before the tragedy, before the headlines, before the long wait for justice, they were simply women of the nickel, living, laughing, loving, surviving. Their stories didn't start in those abandoned houses. Their stories started here, in the heart of Fifth Ward, where life is never easy, but people find ways to shine anyway. Fifth Ward keeps its own time. Life moves between the familiar landmarks, Liberty Road, Gregg Street, Davis Street, in the same rhythms it always has. But sometimes those rhythms break. Sometimes the familiar becomes fatal. For Hattie McFarland, that break came on February 28, 2007. She was doing what she'd always done, walking the streets she knew better than anyone. At 43, Hattie had spent most of her life navigating the Nichols maze of possibilities and pitfalls. That Wednesday, she moved through her neighborhood one last time, passing the same faces, the same corners, the same abandoned buildings that dotted the landscape like gaps in a smile. Then she entered one of those empty houses on Davis Street. It was the kind of place everyone knew to avoid after dark. Windows were broken like missing teeth, walls holding decades of silence. But in the nickel, sometimes choices aren't really choices at all. Sometimes survival means taking risks. That night, someone passing by looked through one of those broken windows. What they saw would haunt Fifth Ward for years. Hattie's body, brutally beaten, a bloody brick telling the story no one wanted to hear. The silence in that abandoned house had turned violent, and the nickel had lost one of its daughters. 3 years passed. 3 years of whispered warnings, of looking over shoulders, of wondering who could do such a thing. 3 years of a killer walking free. Then came Lavinia Glover's last walk, July 7, 2010. Security cameras caught her moving down Newhoff Road, not alone. A man walked beside her, someone whose identity would remain a mystery for far too long. The footage shows them heading toward another cluster of abandoned houses, another set of broken windows and empty rooms. When Lavinia didn't come home to her children that night, people knew. In neighborhoods like the Nickel, mothers don't just disappear. Not willing ones, not good ones, not like Lavinia. They found her the next day, another empty house, another brutal end. She lay face down on a dirty mattress, her skull crushed by someone's rage. 28 years old, 3 children waiting at home. Another daughter of Fifth Ward was silenced forever. 2 women, 2 abandoned houses, 2 brutal deaths. The pattern was impossible to ignore, but impossible to prove. Not yet. The similarities haunted investigators. Both women were killed in empty houses, both beaten to death, and both left like secrets in the Nickel's forgotten spaces. But similarities don't solve cases. Evidence does. And evidence has a way of hiding in the shadows of abandoned houses. Fifth Ward absorbed these losses, the way it had absorbed so many others, with a mix of sorrow and survival. People walked a little faster past the empty building. Mothers held their children a little closer. Everyone wondered, who else might be watching from those dark windows? Who else might be waiting in those empty rooms? The answers would take years to surface. Years of families waiting, of detectives searching, of a community haunted by the knowledge that somewhere, maybe nearby, a killer walked free. But the Nickel doesn't forget its own. And sometimes, justice just needs time to find its way home. Every homicide detective knows the first 48 hours are crucial. But in the Nickel's empty houses, time moves differently. Evidence fades faster. Witnesses become scarcer. Secrets sink deeper into crumbling walls. When Houston PD arrived at that abandoned house on Davis Street in 2007, they found more questions than answers. Hattie McFarland's body told a story of violence, the bloody brick beside her spelling out the brutal end of her life. But the killer? The killer was already a ghost, vanished into Fifth Ward's maze of streets and silence. The detectives did what detectives do. They canvassed the neighborhood, knocked on doors, and asked hard questions. People knew Hattie, how could they not? She'd been a fixture in the nickel for decades. But knowing someone and knowing what happened to them are different things entirely. She went in alone, people said. That's all they could offer. In neighborhoods like Fifth Ward, seeing too much can be dangerous. Knowing too much, even more so. The evidence from that empty house on Davis Street went into storage. The case went cold. And somewhere in the nickel, a killer walked free. 3 years later, different house, same story. When Lavinia Glover's body was discovered in 2010, veteran detectives felt a chill of recognition. Another empty house, another brutal beating, another woman from the nickel was silenced forever. But this time, they had something new. Grainy security footage showing Lavinia walking with a man. A face in the shadows, a figure who would haunt investigators for years to come. They worked the case hard. The footage became their focal point. Countless hours spent studying that ghostly image, trying to put a name to a shadow. They showed it around the nickel, hoping someone would recognize the man who'd walked Lavinia to her death. But recognition and revelation are different things in neighborhoods where silence is survival. Both cases slipped into that peculiar limbo of cold case files. Boxes on shelves, evidence in storage, families waiting for answers that seemed like they'd never come. The years piled up like dust in those abandoned houses. 2011, 2012, 2013. But sometimes, science catches up with silence. By 2020, DNA technology had evolved. What was once unreadable became a story waiting to be told. When Houston PD's cold case unit revisited the evidence, they weren't just looking through old files. They were looking with new eyes. The breakthrough came from the Utah State Crime Lab. Months of meticulous work, of extracting profiles from evidence that had waited years to tell its truth. Then suddenly, a match, a name, a face to go with that shadow in the security footage. Roy Dabney. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was flesh and blood, already serving 25 years for other crimes. His DNA told stories he'd never meant to tell. Stories about Lavinia's last moments. Stories that would soon connect him to Hattie's case as well. The pieces started falling into place. Dabney had lived in the nickel during both murders. He'd walked the same streets as Hattie and Lavinia, haunted the same corners, and knew the same abandoned houses. The security footage that had haunted investigators for years suddenly had a name to go with that shadowy figure. On November 1st, 2024, justice finally had a face. Roy Dabney was charged with both murders, his $2 million bond for each count, ensuring he wouldn't disappear into the nickel's shadows again.
This week, Dabney was brought back to Harris County.
Mr. Dabney has a conviction of your bond.
Arraigned for the 2 murders, Dabney said nothing as the cold case allegations were read, and the state told him they had DNA proving he killed the women.
But for the investigators, questions still lingered. In a neighborhood with so many abandoned houses and so many dark corners, how many other secrets might Dabney have left behind? How many other shadows might still be waiting to step into the light? Sometimes solving one mystery only reveals others. But for now, at least, 2 of the nickel's daughters were one step closer to justice. Courtrooms have a way of making time collapse. Sitting in that Houston courtroom in late 2024, watching Roy Dabney face justice, it felt like 2007 and 2010 weren't so far away anymore. The years of silence were about to be broken. The families of Hattie McFarland and Lavinia Glover filled the benches, shoulder to shoulder with Fifth Ward residents who'd carried these stories for too long. They came to witness what many had thought impossible, the moment when the Nichols' darkest secrets would finally see the light. The prosecution's case unfolded like a dark tapestry. First came the DNA evidence, science giving voice to victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The prosecutors walked the jury through each discovery, each match, each undeniable link between Dabney and the women he'd silenced. Then came that security footage, grainy images that had haunted investigators for years. Now, enhanced and analyzed, it showed more than just shadows. It showed Lavinia's last moments, walking beside a man now unmistakably identified as Dabney. The same man who'd been living in their community, hiding in plain sight all those years.
Says he went alone into this convenience store. Police pulled the footage, but were never able to identify the man.
The defense tried to punch holes in the evidence. They spoke of reasonable doubt, of circumstantial connections, of DNA that could have innocent explanations. But science doesn't lie, and neither did the pattern of violence that emerged as prosecutors connected the dots between both murders.
By saying DNA is going to tie him to these cases. It's faulty science. It, in and of itself, is not enough.
DNA helps us solve those cases more than anything.
Expert witnesses took the stand, breaking down the brutal similarities between how Hattie and Lavinia died. Same method, same violence. Same preference for abandoned houses where screams would echo off empty walls. The randomness wasn't random at all. It was a signature written in blood. Through it all, Dabney sat impassive, his presence a reminder of how monsters can wear human faces. He'd been walking the Nichols streets when these women died, breathing the same air, seeing the same sights. He'd been there all along, holding his secrets close, thinking time would keep them safe. But time had other plans. When the jury retired to deliberate, you could feel the weight of years in that courtroom, the weight of vigils held, of tears shed, of questions asked that seemed to have no answers, the weight of two families who'd carried grief for far too long. The verdict, when it came, hit like thunder. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. Life without parole, that was the sentence. No more shadows to hide in. No more secrets to keep. No more empty houses to make into graves. Roy Dabney would spend the rest of his days in a cell, far from the streets where he'd hunted. For the families, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice couldn't bring back Hattie's laugh or Lavinia's smile. It couldn't fill the empty chairs at family gatherings or heal the scars of loss. But it could do what justice does best. It could bring truth into the light. The abandoned houses still stand in Fifth Ward, their broken windows still watching the streets. But they don't hold the same power anymore. Their secrets have been told. Their shadows have been named. And somewhere, maybe, Hattie McFarland and Lavinia Glover can finally rest in peace. Roy Dabney sits in his cell now, but questions still echo through the Nichols streets. How many other cold cases are waiting for science to catch up with their secrets? How many other families are still waiting for answers? How many other communities carry the weight of unsolved crimes? In abandoned houses across America, evidence grows cold. Clues fade like old paint. Memories blur like graffiti in the rain. But somewhere in that decay, truth waits. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes new technology. Sometimes it just takes someone willing to look with fresh eyes. Remember Hattie's vibrant spirit, how she could light up a room with her laugh. Remember Lavinia's devoted heart, and how she lived for her children. Remember that they were more than victims. They were daughters of Fifth Ward, women who faced life's hardships with courage until darkness found them. If you know something about an unsolved case in your community, remember this story. Remember how one piece of evidence, one small detail, and one moment of courage to speak up can break years of silence. Cold cases only stay cold when we let them, for their families, for their community, for every other victim still waiting for justice. Keep asking questions. Keep demanding answers. Keep holding on to hope. Because sometimes justice moves slowly, through abandoned houses and empty years, but it never stops moving. Sometimes truth just needs time to find its way home. If this story moved you and made you think about unsolved cases in your community, share it. Not for likes or views, but because somewhere out there, another family is waiting for answers. Another community carries the weight of uncertainty. Another truth waits to be found. We're working on more stories like this. Cases that need to be told, voices that need to be heard, and truths that need to come to light. Check out the related videos appearing on your screen now. Until next time, remember that every victim has a name, every case has a story, and every truth, no matter how long it is buried, deserves to be told. Stay safe, stay aware, and never stop asking questions.